Hi friends, Abby here. I am so excited to show you guys today what I've been working on the past month and a half since quarantine started. Um, Decided to take on a woodworking project. It's something my dad has done my whole life and my granddad did as well. And so I just kind of wanted to learn more about what he does. Obviously I'm in my dad's shop today. So I decided to do a honeycomb table or a hexagon epoxy table. I really am a geometric person, love geometric designs. So that's just kind of was my decision. And it's taken a month and a half. Never thought that a project this small would take so long. I definitely have a appreciation for what my dad does now. But without further ado, so a month and a half for a 30 by 20 table. But it's gorgeous and I am absolutely in love with it, and it's everything that I ever thought it could be. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through my process and let's get started. So the first part of building this table was just the design process. Kind of had to figure out what I wanted my hexagons to look like, how big I wanted my table to be. So that took a couple days. Originally I wanted to use regular hexagons because it just makes cutting a lot easier if everything is the same, like all the sides are the same length. But I didn't like the way that it looked, and I'm picky. So we ended up going with an irregular hexagon. This is the size that we ended up going with. So it's 4 3/5 this way, or 5 inches this way, and 4 3/5 tall. So once I decided on that, we could go ahead and get started with actually putting together the wood and cutting out the pieces. So we decided to use scrap wood for a lot of the hexagon pieces because my dad has it laying around everywhere. So I had to pull pieces out of the scrap piles and match grains. So like cherry, made sure that the cherry looked right together and the maple looked right together so that when it was finished, I didn't have a bunch of conglomeration of pieces. It looked more like individual hexagons. It came together to make one piece. After I picked out the pieces, I had to put them through 2 machines. The first one is a joiner, which is right here. And the second one is a planer, which is right here. And the point of the joiner is that you create perfect joints. So when you go to glue 2 pieces of wood together, there's not a gap between the joints. They're together. And then the point of the planer is actually to make sure that the 2 sides of the wood are in a plane. And after we did both of those things, we could glue them together, clamp them, let them dry for a few hours so that we could work with them. After everything was glued and cured, we put all of the pieces of wood through the planer at the same time to make sure that everything was the same height, because you don't want something that's 2 inches taller than something else in your table. And then we went ahead and cut those boards into about 5 1/4 inch pieces. Remember that our hexagons had a width about 5 inches. We knew we wanted some working room. So we went and used the chop saw, which is this machine behind me. And we set up a jig, which is basically an apparatus that just allows you to cut the same cut over and over and over again. So we went ahead and cut all those pieces into 5 inches so that we can move on to cutting the corners off of the hexagons. So after all the squares were cut, next we had to cut the hexagons out. And we measured this angle and we knew that it was 27.5 degrees. So we set the chop saw to 27.5 degrees, which is beautiful because as long as you have a jig, you can always cut 27.5 degrees. But the problem was that on our first cut, we were getting a flat edge here. So the corner wasn't nice and sharp like these corners. It was flat, and that bothers me. So we actually had to cut one side and then flip the piece over, add a 1/4 inch jig in to cut the other side so that all of the corners were pointed. So I think originally I cut out about 27 hexagon pieces. Decided after I laid them all out that it wasn't enough. I went back to the drawing board, glued together more wood, cut out some more hexagons, ended up with about 36 hexagons. I just wanted a little bit more length on the table. Didn't work out exactly how I planned the first time, but that's okay. I added those pieces. And then I had to decide how much space I actually wanted in between the hexagon pieces. And originally I thought about 3/4 of an inch, but I decided that was too much and bumped it down to about 1/2 inch. Once that was decided, I made sure all my pieces were in the right place. I numbered each piece so that once I took it apart so I could build the form, I would be able to replicate where each of those pieces was originally laid out. And then I had to cut some pieces in half, because if you notice at the beginning, some parts of my table don't have whole hexagons. It ends on like a half a hexagon or a quarter of a hexagon. So then we had to go back to the chop saw, cut off half pieces, actually this way, half pieces, or cut out quarter pieces for the corners, and get those laid out in the form. Once all of that was laid out, I put in all my 1/2 inch spacers, and I had to measure the length and the height of that table, because I needed to build a form for the epoxy to mold in. And if I didn't know the exact length and height, then I wouldn't be able to build the form correct, and we'd have to restart, which we ended up having to do anyway. Messed it up once, measured incorrectly, cut too small a form, had to start over and cut it again. But we did get it worked out, and I laid out all of my hexagons again, length and height, just to make sure this time they're gonna fit in there. Once I made sure that it was all gonna fit, we covered the mold in tuck tape, which I can show you right here. It's basically just a really slick tape that keeps the epoxy from molding to the form, because obviously you want to be able to knock the form away and just have the table left. Once the mold was taped, we screwed it together, and then we added caulk in all of the joints, because this plastic epoxy that we use is like water, so it will find its way out of any joint that you have. So I think we caulked it a total of 3 times just to make sure that it would not leak. And then we went outside back into the shop and we leveled the mold, because it's like water. So if your mold is higher on one side, you'll have a lot of epoxy over here and not a lot of epoxy over here, which is not something you want. Once it was leveled, set back out all my hexagons, put in all the spacers, spent a lot of time making sure that it was close to perfect, close as I could get. And then we used pieces of wood straight down each row of hexagons, clamped those pieces down, because when you pour the epoxy in, the wood floats, and all those spaces that you worked so hard for move. So we clamped down each row of hexagons. I took my spacers out, and then if there was any hexagon that still was moving a little bit, we added like a little shiv under there, or a little piece of cardboard to kind of lessen that gap and keep it from moving. After everything was clamped down and we were as close as perfect to what we were gonna get, we went ahead and mixed the resin, and we used pourable plastic clear casting resin by Incredible Solutions. It's a 2-part, so you use like 2 parts of this, 1 part of that, or something like that. And then we added dye to that, and we used Illumidust Black Pearl. We mixed it together, we poured it in, we made sure to degas, so you just go ahead and use blowtorch and get all those bubbles off the top. They'll pop immediately. Don't want to leave those, because they'll leave like bubbles in your resin when it dries. That stuff takes a little while to set up, so the next morning it was still jelly, and what we realized is that the resin had fallen about 1/4 of an inch, just because it had made its way into all the little cracks and crevices of the wood. So because the resin was still workable, we went ahead and added a little bit more resin just to make sure that we could keep the full thickness of the table, because we didn't want to get rid of any thickness. And then we let that sit for about a week, because didn't want to work with it until it was completely cured. We just didn't want to mess anything up. So after I patiently, or more like impatiently, waited the week, we took the piece, we took the clamps off, we took the mold off, and we took the piece down to a local mill, because here at the house we don't have a piece of machinery that's wide enough to fit a 20-inch table, but they did. So we took it down there, they put it through their belt sander, and we just wanted to get the wood and the epoxy level. So on the top and the bottom, we wanted to make sure there wasn't any uneven places where the epoxy was lower than the wood, or the epoxy was over the wood. So once they got that all figured out, we brought it home and we cleaned up the edges of the table. So we got the top and the bottom done at the mill, and then we just put the edges of the table through table saw to kind of get rid of any of the imperfections that were on the edges. So during the sanding and the cutting process, we realized that there were a few holes in the top of the table where the bars had been laying that the gas wasn't able to escape. So we filled those holes with 5-minute epoxy. We decided to leave it clear because we didn't want to try to match the color already on the table and create a different color and be able to see that color change. The clear would just carry the same color throughout. So we just left it clear. We let that dry for a few days. And then we flipped the table over and we decided to sand the bottom down to about 600 and test some finishes because we didn't quite know what we wanted to use. And we decided on Waterlocks, which is basically a tongue oil compound. After the decision about the finish was made, I went ahead and flipped it over, dry sanded the top and the sides down to about 320 grit, and then wet sanded it, which means I used water with the sandpaper down to 2500 grit. And in retrospect, that was probably too much, but I really wanted to make sure there wasn't any scratches in the epoxy. We let the piece just sit for a day because we didn't want to seal the water into the wood with the finish. And then we added 4 coats of tongue oil, and that got us to our final product. And I'm still waiting on the legs, which I decided on metal hairpin legs that are supposed to be delivered today. Overall, I'm just super happy with the way that this turned out. I'm pretty proud of myself, and it's not something that I ever thought that I would have the patience to do, but it definitely turned out awesome. And now my dad and I are already thinking about our next project. I hope that you guys are finding something to do during this time and that you're staying well and healthy. See you later.